What if events went differently? What if Spider-Man chose a different path in the final act of Spider-Man 3 at the church? What would have happened? What would have changed? Find out in today's 4 different scenarios. You get to choose this time. You get to choose what scenario and what alternate reality you want to explore. So I'm going to be posing 4 different alternate realities, and you're going to be choosing which one you want to go to, and maybe you want to choose all 4 of them. I would hope you choose all 4 of them for some extra watch time. No, I'm kidding, but I really do hope you guys enjoy this brand new series where I will be diving deep into fan fiction scenarios, and I thought for episode 2, we're also going to do another throwback to what if Spider-Man was consumed by the symbiote, but we're going to be looking at different alternate realities, not just with him being consumed by the symbiote, but I thought let's pose some other alternate questions at this very scene where we see the camera pan wanting to make that choice. And you're going to be able to make that choice and see where that reality leads to. Now, we're going to be going into a shorter format with these fan fictions because I don't want it to be too long, but I want it to be long enough so you guys can kind of digest it and see where this would have been taken. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the series, and if you want to see more of it, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn your notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date with the latest content. But anyways, as always, choose your path, guys.
Feels like you lose yourself. Oh, Venom. Spider-Man. No more. I need your help. I'm by myself. Are you? Have you not been so selfish?
Spider-Man had to get rid of the symbiote after the events at the club with Mary Jane. He finally realized that the suit was making him do all these terrible choices, like stealing Gwen Stacy from Eddie Brock and hurting Harry Osborn. Peter became selfish, but at the end of the second act, he knew what he needed to do. He had to remove the symbiote. He went to the church thinking it was all over. He removed the suit, giving up the power and becoming more responsible with his choices. But what if he kept going down the wrong path, not seeing himself do selfish acts? What if the symbiote clouded his mind so much that he couldn't even come back? Let's say in this alternate timeline, Peter jumps down to the church bells trying to rip his suit off, but it's not working. He would try his hardest, pulling the suit from his hands, screaming in pain while he tries his best to get rid of the suit, but it's just not enough. The symbiote had gained full control of Spider-Man, and it would block out its weaknesses, kind of like the 1994 animated series. He would start turning into Venom, and with one last ditch effort, Peter jumps onto the bell, but the symbiote kept fighting, showing Peter's flashes of his Uncle Ben getting killed and the hatred that he had. His friends betrayed him. He wanted Mary Jane, but now he can't have any of it. He was stuck as Spider-Man and this new monster. A white flash in the sky went off, and Eddie Brock took a picture of Peter trying to rip the symbiote off, and he started running, but Peter saw this and he froze, jumping down below looking at Eddie. Eddie would be choked out, but he would escape, going to the Daily Bugle with proof Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Spider-Man did not learn the weaknesses of Venom, and he screamed as he was consumed, becoming full Venom. His eyes would tighten, and a paper went in the wind near his feet, showing Spider-Man shows his true colors. Eddie Brock revealed to J. Jonah Jameson that Peter was Spider-Man, showing him a photo of Peter removing the symbiote from the church. J. Jonah Jameson wouldn't even be able to believe Eddie, as he already photoshopped Spider-Man, and he yelled at him, telling him to get out of the building and that he was a liar. Spider-Man swung into the Daily Bugle, seeing J. Jonah Jameson and Eddie Brock. J. Jonah Jameson yelled, calling Spider-Man a menace, and Spider-Man looked to see Eddie with a picture. He tried running, but Spider-Man quickly jumped and kicked Eddie in the face, having enough of him. He was going to finish him off once and for all. He ruined his Spider-Man reputation job, and now he was going to be taking his revenge. He looked at J. Jonah Jameson smiling. Spider-Man, in fact, would give in to the symbiote, choking Eddie to death in front of J. Jonah Jameson. J. Jonah Jameson ran, trying to save Eddie, and he would be thrown to the ground. Cops ran into the building to see Spider-Man as Venom and Captain Captain Stacy would be there with 2 other cops, and they would try shooting at Spider-Man. He dodged the attacks, leaving. Spider-Man didn't know what to do, and J. Jonah Jameson knew that he needed to reveal Spider-Man's identity to the world, and he would try phoning Peter Parker, but the dots were starting to connect. He would shoot a live broadcast revealing that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, showing a picture of him to the world. Sandman, like our original timeline, would try hunting down Spider-Man, and he knew that he killed Peter's Uncle Ben, and he wanted revenge, but now he knows who Spider-Man is, and Sandman would kidnap Mary Jane, going to her house and grabbing her. He was on top of the construction site, and Spider-Man would fight him there. It was Venom versus Sandman. Spider-Man was so consumed, and he wanted his revenge with his uncle, and he would fully embrace the symbiote, dodging all of Sandman's attacks. Harry learned the full truth with his father killing himself, and he knew that whatever Peter had on him, it was controlling him. He needed to end this, and he needed to stop the fight with Sandman and Spider-Man. Harry needed to save Mary Jane, and he went on his glider as the new Goblin, using pumpkin bombs in the air to destroy Sandman. Sandman was blown to shreds, and Harry zoomed in with his glider, but Spider-Man saw this, thinking Harry was going to go after him, and he used the symbiote, grabbing the glider. Harry would be sent flying, smashing his face off of a metal pole like the original timeline. Spider-Man webbed his hands up, revealing his face to Harry Osborn. He had tears in his eyes, and he was about to kill Harry, but Mary Jane ran, yelling for Peter to stop, and Harry could see the poles do something to Peter's suit, and he yelled at Peter, telling him that he was being controlled, and Peter had flashbacks of Dr. Connors asking him to get rid of the symbiote, and that it was going to consume him. Harry was too weak, and Peter looked at Mary Jane, knowing what he was doing was wrong, and he dropped the glider. He fell on the ground, and Mary Jane asked Peter to get rid of the symbiote, and Peter yelled, saying that it was too late. Peter started screaming in pain as he was ripping the symbiote off of himself, and he would get rid of it. Mary Jane, in our timeline, would free Harry from the webs, and he threw a pumpkin bomb at the symbiote, blowing it up, and Peter would be exhausted, falling to the ground, knocked out. Harry brought him back to his place, and all 3 of them would live in this alternate timeline. Peter would be forgiven, and he went into hiding after being exposed as Spider-Man, but he would go to Aunt May's at the end of the film. She told Peter that he did the right thing and that she was happy that he was okay. This timeline would have Sandman as the main villain in Spider-Man 4, and Peter would battle it out with him in the 4th movie. Spider-Man needed to remove the symbiote to create Venom, leading into the final act of the film. Spider-Man had to do this because he realized that if he didn't, time was going to be short and he could become a monster himself. He removed the symbiote, not giving into power, and Eddie had to go to the church because he felt so bad that he wanted to kill Peter Parker. Eddie was a very religious person, and he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. What if Eddie Brock, though, didn't give in to his hatred for Spider-Man and Peter Parker? But what if he left the church at night, going to Gwen's, trying to get forgiveness? Eddie Brock went back to the club, not going to the church, seeing Gwen Stacy there with Mary Jane. They explained to him what Peter did to them, and Gwen and Eddie Brock would go together that night, leaving for her place. Mary Jane went back to her house, and Spider-Man removed the symbiote like the original timeline, but the symbiote died, not being able to bond with anyone else, and it tried, but it would starve to death, dying in the rain. Peter went back to his place like the original timeline, and this time Sandman and Venom wouldn't team up. Peter became Spider-Man once again after the church events, and he started swinging at night, coming face to face with Flint Marko once again. Since Mary Jane isn't being held hostage like the original timeline, our new universe can go over different scenarios. Spider-Man fixes his life up, and Sandman and Harry would both continue to live, or the best possible scenario. Spider-Man faces off against Flint Marko and Harry. They would team up to fight Spider-Man. We are going to continue with the second option. Spider-Man and Flint talked in the alleyway, and Spider-Man still had anger, but not as much with Flint Marko since he didn't have the symbiote. Flint tried to explain to Peter what happened, but he didn't accept his apology. They would start fighting, and Sandman knew that Spider-Man was weaker, not being able to keep up with him as Spider-Man didn't have the symbiote in this timeline. Spider-Man got slammed into a wall with a massive punch by Sandman, and since Harry doesn't have to save Spider-Man in this scenario, his butler wouldn't tell him about his father being killed, and Harry grabbed his suit and he started flying into the city. Spider-Man escaped Sandman's grasp, and they would continue to fight throughout the city, and it would be live on TV. Harry saw them battling it out in the distance, and Sandman smashed Spider-Man into a wall, and he would break out falling, and Spider-Man tried using his webs, but Harry cut them, breaking the webs. Sandman and the new Goblin teamed up in our new timeline, fighting Spider-Man around the city, leading into the construction site, but Mary Jane wouldn't be held hostage. It was a fight for revenge. Harry used a pumpkin bomb, but Spider-Man dodged the attack, throwing it into Sandman, and he would blow up, and Harry would also blow up from the blast. The explosion would cause cause a massive shockwave and Spider-Man would be sent to the ground with Harry Osborn. He was on the ground on his back. Spider-Man knew that he didn't want to finish his friend off, and Harry used the same old trick in the book that his father once did in the first film. The glider zoomed in the air and Peter heard it doing a backflip as he screamed his name in the air. Harry Osborn would be sent flying into a pillar with the Goblin glider. Harry was dead and Sandman would reform, telling Spider-Man that he didn't want this and he would finally explain everything to him. And Peter told Sandman that he didn't want to see him ever again, and Flint would leave Spider-Man with Harry Osborn dead on the ground. And Spider-Man cried, picking his body up, and there would be a funeral for Harry Osborn. The team up would resort into the death of Harry Osborn because he still thinks that Peter killed his father and not being able to listen to reason because he became consumed by the Goblin serum like his father once did, and it would be his downfall. And because Venom isn't in this timeline, Sandman and Spider-Man would still be rivals because Sandman had to work on his own, so this is why I believe this timeline would mostly play out if the symbiote wasn't in the final act of the film. Peter throughout the movie slowly loses control of the symbiote around the second act of the film, where he is about to rip the symbiote off of him. He wasn't able to control the suit because he didn't know it was going to be giving into dark emotions like hatred and revenge. He had control when he first got it, but after that it was slowly taking him over, and this is even said when Dr. Connors looks at the suit for the first time, asking Peter to get rid of it. What if he was able to control the symbiote before he removed it? What if he learned what the symbiote was going to do, and what if he made a deal with it? Becoming a better hero and a stronger hero, giving in to Venom being the best host for the symbiote. The scenario can be run in many different ways in the timeline, but the way it would play out is he's about to remove the symbiote and betray the symbiote. He knew that it was going to destroy his life and he had no choice but to remove it, but the symbiote knew that it needed Peter, and maybe being evil and blocking its true power wasn't the actual way. The symbiote was about to be removed by Spider-Man, and the symbiote would start talking to Peter in his head, and Peter stopped fighting, being frozen in shock, learning that it was truly alive. Eddie would see Spider-Man and he was about to take a picture of him, and Peter's spider sense went off and he looked down below doing a backflip, and the symbiote told Peter that they needed to work together, and Spider-Man looked at Eddie and he ran away, dropping his camera. Spider-Man took the camera, looking at it, and he dropped it on the ground. He left the church talking to the symbiote in his mind, and the symbiote would unlock more powers for Spider-Man, and in this timeline it would be forever changed. Since Eddie, like this scenario 1, didn't get the symbiote, the deal with Sandman wouldn't happen, or would it? Eddie ran into an alleyway and another man was walking in the distance. Eddie tripped over and fell near the man, and it was Flint Marko. Flint told Eddie to keep moving and he asked why he was out of breath, and Eddie yelled, saying that it was Spider-Man, and Flint demanded, wanting to know where he was going, and he looked up while it was still raining and he could see Spider-Man swinging away from the church. He pushed Eddie out of the way with sand and he hit him to the ground, and Eddie would be knocked out. Sandman followed Spider-Man and he was heading home, but Sandman used a mega fist in the air, but Spider-Man dodged the attack, doing a backflip. He landed on his legs and the symbiote screamed, morphing into Venom, and Spider-Man would fight Sandman at night as it was raining, but Spider-Man, having full control of his suit, would best Sandman. Sandman tried using his powers, but the weather was getting worse for him and he had no plan or help to fight Spider-Man. Spider-Man got sent flying into cars and he fell onto the ground, but the symbiote caught his fall. He used the symbiote web to a fire hydrant and it went everywhere, going onto Sandman, and he screamed as he died in front of Peter once again. Spider-Man, after defeating Sandman for the second time in the film, went to Mary Jane and revealed to her about his new powers and how he was being controlled by the symbiote, but now he can control his suit, and he turned into Venom in front of her, telling her that they made a deal. She was scared and told Peter to leave right away, and he was confused knowing that this was it. He had full power and she didn't want any of it. He could have a normal life, but now it was too late for that. Mary Jane, being scared of Peter and his new powers, would avoid him, and she stopped talking to Peter altogether. Bernard told Harry that his father killed himself and that Spider-Man didn't do it. He couldn't even believe it, and in this scenario, Harry would give up being the new Goblin, seeing that he didn't want to become his father and fight Spider-Man. It just wasn't worth it. The main villain of the film would still be Sandman, and Eddie Brock in our timeline, after being down on his luck, would still become a criminal. He went to Mary Jane's house, saying that he wanted to get revenge because Peter took his girl and he felt like he needed to take his. After seeing that he was worthless ridiculous in that it was all in his head. He was almost like Carnage. He had the mind of Carnage, slowly becoming mental. Mary Jane went into a cab and Eddie pointed a gun at her. He took her up the construction site getting a hostage, and he started yelling for Spider-Man and Peter, knowing the truth after seeing him at the church. Spider-Man followed Eddie, taking the gun out of his hand, defeating him, but Sandman would slowly show up, throwing MJ off the construction site. Spider-Man used the symbiote, but loud noises would go off and it would start disrupting the symbiote. He tried to save her, but it would be too late. Mary Jane died after the fall, and she would fall to her death, and Spider-Man screamed for Flint Marko, knowing that he didn't learn his lesson with great power because he didn't trust his own power, and for that he paid the ultimate price by letting his new abilities get to him, and it led to Mary Jane being killed in this alternate timeline. Harry Osborn would show up in the New Goblin suit fighting Sandman, and Spider-Man would defeat him. He screamed knowing that it was all his fault, and he cried having Mary Jane in his hands, and Harry would have his head down knowing that he could have helped sooner, and Mary Jane would have a funeral at the end of the movie, and Peter and Harry would forgive each other at the end of the movie in this alternate timeline. The symbiote would still be on Spider-Man, and Peter needed it more than ever to block the pain and depression in this alternate timeline. Someone close to Peter needed to become Venom leading into the final act of Spider-Man 3. Eddie Brock, being Peter's somewhat co-worker at the Bugle, was a great pick. Them having arguments and drama at work led into even more bigger things in the film, like Peter stealing Eddie's job and girl. Eddie was a big character in Spider-Man 3, and for him to learn about Peter Parker's identity at the church led into all the original events with Sandman teaming up with Venom to Harry Osborn's death. It was unavoidable once he was at the church not to become Venom. What if events changed in Spider-Man 3 at the end of the second act of the film? What if a bigger character that already knew Peter's identity and even more secrets had the symbiote? How would this danger Peter Parker and Harry Osborn? This scenario might be one of the most fun ones. Mary Jane having the symbiote could be run in so many different ways, but her not getting appreciated by Peter Parker for losing her job and being tricked by Harry Osborn into losing Peter, all of these events remind you of Eddie Brock, but almost flipped in a different way. Let's see what happens. Mary Jane, after being hit to the ground and embarrassed at her job, ran into the rain, seeing that Peter Parker was gone. She went to get forgiveness, knowing that she could have been married to Peter, and she knew she was tricked by Harry Osborn. She thought he made Peter this way. How did she not see it? Peter loved her so much that he was willing to change himself to win her back over in this alternate timeline. Mary Jane would convince herself that Harry Osborn was the true villain that wanted to disrupt everything, and now she lost the one man that really loved her from the start. Mary Jane went to the church hearing screaming and noises. She was scared and she opened the door, and Eddie Brock was sitting from rows behind looking at Mary Jane. Mary Jane went into the area and Peter was screaming in pain, and he removed the symbiote and it went on to Mary Jane. She started laughing and screaming, and she could finally see that she had all of the power that Peter once had. She looked through the symbiote's memories, seeing that Peter did love Mary Jane, and she started screaming and smiling. Eddie Brock ran to see her and he tried running off, but Mary Jane jumped in front of him and she looked at him. Mary Jane killed Eddie for causing Peter so much trouble, and she ended up leaving the church. She started web swinging, wanting to go to Peter's, but she would be stopped by Sandman and they would fight each other. Mary Jane would win the fight, but she would escape the Sandman, not being able to fully defeat him, and I think this is the best way because she just gained the symbiote and doesn't really know how to fully use it, so in this scenario she would run away from the Sandman, but Flint will be back soon. Mary Jane went home with the new symbiote, changing back to normal, looking within the symbiote's memories, and this power can be done because we are putting the Spider-Man 3 The Black into canon within this new timeline. She saw the full truth with Harry Osborn and how Spider-Man let the killer go in the first film. Peter went to see MJ like the original timeline, but she wasn't there. He looked into the window and saw something more horrifying than he's ever seen before. It was Mary Jane with the symbiote. He didn't know if he was seeing things, and there would be a city chase. Peter would chase Mary Jane, but MJ used the symbiote to knock Peter out. He woke up seeing the TV screen, but this time it was Harry Osborn that was going to be held hostage, and Mary Jane became more angered with the two of them as the symbiote was consuming her even more. Spider-Man swung there, seeing the writing on the walls, and he freed Harry Osborn, and Harry called for his glider, and they would team up to fight Symbiote Mary Jane. Out of nowhere, Sandman would show up doing a massive clap in the sky, and sand went everywhere. Mary Jane came to her senses, and this time Flint didn't care about forgiveness. He wanted to fight to the end, but Spider-Man would use his webs with the pumpkin bomb that Harry threw, as it could only be the way to defeat Flint Marko. His body would blow up, and there would be screams heard from miles away, and he would finally be destroyed. I'm going to branch this timeline now. We can go with Peter and Harry turning on Mary Jane to try to remove the symbiote, saving her, or Mary Jane betrays both of them, killing Peter. I'm going to be going with option 1, and as Sandman was destroyed, Harry turned his head and Peter nodded as Peter used his webs on Mary Jane's back, ripping the symbiote off of her as she was crying and screaming. Harry smashed the pipes and the symbiote was thrown to the ground and he blew it up, and the fight was officially over. Harry lives in this alternate timeline, and Mary Jane distanced herself with Peter and Harry after the battle, not being able to trust herself. Mary Jane obsessed over the powers of the symbiote and Spider-Man, and she went to Dr. Connors' place and took the last bit of symbiote, and that's where we're going to end this scenario. It would end up leading into Spider-Man 4 with She-Venom, and the last parts of the symbiote at the construction site would go on to a new host, and that host would be Cletus Cassidy himself, Carnage. This is going to be our 4 scenarios with Spider-Man trying to remove the symbiote at the second act of the film. I really like the last scenario where Mary Jane becomes Venom, as Eddie Brock and Mary Jane's situation near the second act of the film is almost the same, and I feel like she really could have stood a chance of becoming She-Venom and having hatred for Harry Osborn, as she knew she was being tricked by Harry Osborn. Tell me what your favorite scenario was in the comments down below, and do make sure to subscribe if you are new around here, because 80% of you aren't subscribed, and it only really takes 1 second to be subscribed, so do make sure you guys do that. But anyways, as always, thanks for tuning in, and have an amazing day.